All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is how to achieve anything effortlessly. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the paradox of effortless achievement, letting go of the outcome, flow alignment, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. So without further ado, let's get started and talk about the paradox of effortless achievement. Now, before diving into the psychological side of this whole thing and of effortless achievement, it will actually help to ground the entire idea into something physical and observable and something that actually, quite frankly, doesn't need you to believe in it or doesn't need any motivation in general. It depends only on the laws of physics and movement themselves, and that is fluid dynamics. Now, fluid dynamics is a branch of physics that studies how liquids and gases move. It's part of fluid mechanics, and it focuses specifically on motion, meaning how fluids flow, what forces act on them, and how they interact with their surroundings. What makes fluid dynamics powerful is that it applies to anything that flows, meaning water, air, sand, even crowds, but the core idea is basically understanding how substances behave under different conditions. Now, before you click away, this will become relevant pretty quickly, so keep watching. Now, there are two fundamental patterns, laminar and turbulent flow. Laminar flow is smooth and orderly, and you can think of honey that's pouring slowly. It moves in neat parallel layers with minimal mixing, and it's efficient and clean. Turbulent flow, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's chaotic. For instance, a raging river that's crashing over rocks with water going everywhere, or waves crashing at the beach. It's still moving forward, but it's wasting massive amounts of energy doing so. Now, the difference isn't always the fluid itself. It's often the conditions. So if you push water too hard, you get turbulence. If you let it flow naturally, you get laminar flow. If you add obstacles, you get turbulence. If you create a clear path, you get laminar flow. So once you see this, you can basically notice it everywhere. Another example is smoke from a candle. It starts smooth, which is laminar flow, and then it breaks into wild curls, which is turbulent flow, and that turbulence is often caused by wind. Now, this can be applied to everyday life as well. Your morning routine, your focus, your thought process when you're calm versus when you're stressed is the same principle. One flows and the other is chaotic. So fluid dynamics becomes a lens essentially for understanding how energy moves in general, how resistance forms, and why the smoothest path forward often requires no force at all. It exposes two fundamental ways of motion. One is smooth and efficient, and the other is chaotic and energy draining. And once you see these two patterns clearly, you can basically start recognizing the same patterns inside your own behavior. When you apply these two flows onto your own psychology, you'll start understanding why some days feel so smooth and almost impossibly smooth and everything seems to align perfectly, and other days feel like everything is trying to fight you. So effortless achievement happens when you realize that most of the struggle you experience doesn't really come from the task itself, but rather from the turbulence you create internally while pursuing the task or the thing itself, while doing the thing. People assume that pushing harder will speed things up, yet pushing, just like with flow, just like with liquids, often generates eddies, and they slow everything down. The paradox is that the more you try to force movement, the more resistance appears, just as turbulent flow intensifies when excessive force is applied to a fluid that would otherwise glide. Now, once you understand laminar flow, it becomes pretty obvious why your clearest thinking, your creativity, and your sharpest decisions have always happened in moments where you weren't gripped by urgency or some kind of pressure. Your mind was just quiet enough to move in parallel layers, smooth, focused, and aligned. And you begin noticing that trying harder doesn't actually equal moving faster, and that inner centeredness and calm often reveals solutions that pushing harder would have just obscured. So this kind of basically redefines what effort even means. Aligned motion often has a lot more power than pressured motion. Now, psychological turbulence tends to build gradually through three different sources. The first one is mental overactivity, and this is when the mind generates more thoughts than the situation actually requires. It simulates scenarios and outcomes, rehearses conversations, and maybe sometimes in the shower, like a lot of us do, and prepares for problems that don't even exist. It's basically noise disguised as productivity. All it does is burning cognitive fuel without actually moving you forward at all. So you're in mental overactivity when you're thinking about the same thing repeatedly without any new information or without any new insights. Each unnecessary cycle adds friction to your decision making, and dims your perception of what's actually present. So the antidote is clearer thinking, reducing volume so that the signal can emerge. Now, the next one is emotional overinvestment. This happens when you attach disproportionate significance to the outcome or outcomes. You make every step feel heavier than it actually needs to be, and the goal becomes emotionally charged, and that charge distorts your perception and decision making. So you're in emotional overinvestment when success feels like survival. It feels like your life literally depends on it, and failure feels catastrophic, even when the stakes are objectively moderate or non-existent. So this increases stress, it narrows down your focus, and makes you rigid when flexibility would serve you actually better. So the remedy is emotional detachment, caring about the work without needing the outcome to validate your worth. Now, the next one is fear action, meaning taking action from the place of fear rather than alignment and clarity. And this is when decisions and behaviors are driven by avoidance, anxiety, or the desperate need to basically prevent imagined consequences. Instead of moving forward towards something meaningful, you're running away from discomfort. So you're acting from fear when your decisions feel forced, reactive, or like you're trying to avoid a catastrophe rather than create something. And fear-based action creates rushed, rigid behavior that lacks adaptability and often produces the very outcomes you are trying to avoid. So the solution is grounded action, pausing long enough to distinguish between genuine necessity and fear-driven urgency. Now, when all three of these combine, they create internal resistance that feels eerily similar to turbulent flow. It's disjointed, noisy, and energetically expensive. And this is why certain days feel heavy when your workload is the same. Inside turbulence, attention starts scattering, decision-making slows down, and you burn energy simply trying to stay afloat in the churn of your own thoughts. Your inner world becomes this rapid river that is constantly crashing against the rocks and thrashing against itself without making any meaningful moves forward. The problem isn't that the goal is hard itself, it's that the mind is in a state that makes even simple things feel hard. And when you remove the internal rocks such as overthinking, pressure, and attachment, the flow straightens and the same effort suddenly goes 10 times further. So ease does not mean complacency. A lot of people have this feeling that if something feels easy, or if they are experiencing the feeling of ease, that it means that you're being complacent or you're not doing enough. A lot of people are actually addicted to the overworking part, to the force part, to the pushing part of achievement, even though it doesn't get them any further than if they just relaxed. So sometimes it's simply alignment. Ease is just simply alignment. It's what happens when your mind moves the way laminar flow moves, cleanly, directly, without any unnecessary collisions. Now, ease doesn't mean that the task is small or actually easy, but rather that you're no longer fighting yourself while doing it. People often mistake tension, like I said, for effort and anxiety for a commitment, but anyone who has experienced genuine flow knows that performance peaks when the mind actually becomes light. So flow doesn't even necessarily feel hard. For example, musicians enter flow when they stop over-controlling their fingers. Athletes perform best when they trust the body they've trained, and entrepreneurs make the smartest decisions when their minds stop sprinting ahead of the moment. Now, ease allows your full capability to express itself without any interference from the noise of excessive control. And the moment you feel ease, it becomes painfully clear how much effort you've actually wasted before, because you could achieve the same thing with less, or not with less effort, but you could achieve the same thing with a feeling of ease rather than constantly fighting yourself and with a feeling of tension and pressure, and which is to a degree masked perfectionism, but that's a topic for another day. Now, tension, on the other hand, is what turns laminar flow into turbulence. It compresses your attention, it narrows your perception, and it also injects emotional significance into things that don't actually need it. So tension alters your mental physics and creates psychological eddies that break the natural continuity of your thinking. Suddenly, everything feels reactive instead of responsive. Everything is the end of the world if you don't succeed. And you push because you're tense, but pushing increases the tension, and the tension increases the importance, so you push more, and it becomes a vicious circle which creates even more turbulence. The loop becomes basically self-sustaining. Now, noticing the tension is often enough to begin dissolving it. The key is to stop mistaking it for determination. A lot of people think that that tension they're feeling, that pressure they're feeling, they need to be feeling it in order to actually succeed at something or to actually get something done, when in reality, and they mistake it for determination. They think that if they just push through, it will work itself out, when in reality, it doesn't. It doesn't help in any way. Once the tension releases, your perception widens again, and you can start moving with the moment rather than against it, and actually move with flow. Now, presence is the mental equivalent of smoothing out the current so that the flow becomes laminar again. So when you're here, meaning actually here, not in some kind of imagined futures or replayed memories, your actions straighten themselves out. Presence removes the turbulence because turbulence exists only when the mind leaves the moment. Now, presence creates continuity, and continuity is what builds the effortless feeling that people refer to as flow. Now, what felt overwhelming then becomes manageable once you're dealing with a real situation rather than some kind of a mental simulation of it. And decisions that seem complicated now collapse into obvious next steps when the internal noise goes quiet. So alignment happens when your internal state fits the task without any resistance, without contradiction, without inner conflict. And when you feel aligned, your actions feel coherent, your pace feels natural. You're not rushing yourself or pressuring yourself, and your mind stops fighting itself. And this is laminar flow applied to human behavior. Now, misalignment always feels heavier than the situation itself, as if the mind is trying to basically drag the body through a terrain that it hasn't been prepared for. And when alignment returns, everything softens, everything becomes a bit easier, and even complex tasks stop feeling like these battles of survival, essentially, or of survival for your ego, at least. From there, momentum grows on its own because nothing internal is really blocking the movement anymore. And you waste enormous energy when you operate in turbulence. You ruminate, you tighten, you project, you predict, or try to predict, you micromanage. Once all of that noise dissolves, you discover how much capability was actually buried under all these emotional ups and downs. Laminar flow conserves energy because it eliminates unnecessary motion. Effortless achievement works the same way. It removes what doesn't help. It just amplifies what does. High performers look calm because they're not pouring energy into turbulence. They're not suppressing emotion. They simply have nothing chaotic to suppress. Their calmness communicates control, but not the emotional kind of control, but rather more the kind that comes from internal coherence, centeredness, and confidence. And when energy stops leaking, results compound in a way that feels almost unfair to people that are still stuck in turbulence. Now, effortlessness is ultimately a shift in your consciousness. So it's basically understanding that outcomes don't respond to pressure, but to alignment, intention, timing, and psychological balance. It's realizing that when the inner world organizes itself, the outer world becomes easier to navigate as well, because your perception stops distorting the environment. Effort becomes less about pushing and more about placing your energy where it naturally moves forward. You start noticing reality's subtle feedback signals, the ones that turbulence always blinded you to, and you begin to trust the intelligence of flow rather than the adrenaline of force. Now, nature moves through laminar flow everywhere. Roots find their water, waves sculpt shorelines, seasons shift. Nothing really forces itself into being. It simply moves in accordance with structure, with timing, and with balance. Humans struggle because they try to override these principles with emotional intensity, personal timelines, some fake weird deadlines, and excessive importance to things that don't matter. The Taoist principle Wu Wei mirrors laminar flow perfectly. Now, Wu Wei literally translates to non-doing, or action without force, and it emphasizes natural action that aligns with the flow of life rather than resisting it. It doesn't mean inaction or laziness, but rather it means acting at the right time, in the right way, without any unnecessary interference or over effort. Like water flowing around obstacles without resistance, it basically teaches us to move with situations rather than against them, to basically look for the path of least resistance while still reaching our destination. It is essentially intelligent action that comes from deep understanding and presence, not from forcing your will onto reality, but from responding skillfully to what is. Essentially, it's action without strain, progress without pressure, and movement without force. And when your behavior aligns with this principle, you'll stop fighting the moment and begin collaborating with it. And you return to a more natural mode of achievement, one that feels strangely obvious once you actually experience it. With that said, the next part is about the practical foundation of effortless achievement, meaning letting go of outcomes so your mind stops generating turbulence and starts creating the conditions for clean, predictable, efficient movement. So let's talk about letting go of the outcome. Now, letting go of the outcome is one of those ideas that I know sounds almost cliche in theory, but it becomes incredibly practical once you understand how much internal pressure dissolves when you stop gripping the future so tightly. Now, when you attach yourself to a specific result, you basically drag your attention out of the present moment and you're dragging it into a mental simulation that demands constant monitoring. So creating that simulation and the simulation itself produce tension, and the tension becomes resistance. Strangely enough, the harder you cling to the outcome, the more fragile your thinking becomes, because every small deviation feels like a threat. I know what you're thinking. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It just means that you stop clouding the whole process with fear. And most people confuse detachment with indifference, yet they're not even remotely the same. In my opinion, at least, indifference means that you've withdrawn your energy and interest. Detachment, on the other hand, means that you've withdrawn your desperation. You have stopped placing a disproportionate amount of importance onto the thing, which actually gives you more energy to work with. So the moment you separate your identity from the outcome, your thinking expands, your judgment stabilizes, and your presence becomes stronger. You're more in the moment, essentially. And that alone restores the smoothness of laminar flow, because the mind stops creating artificial obstacles or some weird, impossible strive for perfection which can never be reached. Now, attachment creates resistance because it forces your mind to interpret everything through the lens of, is this getting me there fast enough? And that question and questions similar to it generate pressure even when your progress is unfolding perfectly well. You start arguing with reality and you start protesting its timing and trying to basically bend it by force. And this is where internal turbulence begins. The outcome becomes heavier than the process, and that weight disrupts the flow. Once resistance appears, your attention breaks. You're half here, half in the imagined future, and that split is what weakens your clarity and what weakens your motivation and your joy and love for doing the thing. You can feel the split physically. Your breath basically starts going shallow, your thoughts speed up, your decisions become jumpy. The moment you notice that sensation, you're already inside turbulent flow. So letting go starts with loosening your mental grip on what must happen, and there's a quiet strength in allowing that outcome to basically breathe. So yes, you need to choose a direction, but at the same time, you should stop demanding that reality always obeys your script. And this will release psychological and physiological bandwidth, and that bandwidth can return to the task where it actually matters. And you can think about it, most of our creative ideas tend to appear the moment we stop trying to force them. When you release force, your intelligence reactivates and the path forward becomes clearer than anything you could have forced. So trust becomes the stabilizing force that replaces that attachment. You trust your skill, your preparation, your direction, and the natural unfolding of the process, which in turn allows you to actually enjoy the process. So trust doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it prevents uncertainty from mutating into panic. And when trust is present, any setbacks feel like mere adjustments rather than catastrophes. At the end of the day, outcomes aren't earned through stress and pressure and tension. They're earned through consistency, presence, and aligned action, right? Once your trust takes root, you stop obsessing over when, and you focus more on how well, which is what actually creates mastery as well. How well do you do the task? So people cling to outcomes because they're trying to control the uncontrollable. The only part of the process you truly command is really your behavior in the moment. Everything else can be influenced but not necessarily controlled. So letting go means you reclaim your energy from these fantasies that you have of control and redirect it where it actually produces movement and where you actually have control, which is in the doing of the task itself, in the action and the process itself. The more you try to dominate uncertainty, the more uncertain you actually feel. And the more you try to control the uncontrollable, the more out of control you feel. So the only thing you can control is really yourself. And the moment you reclaim control over your internal state, the external environment stops feeling like a battlefield. And the moment you start taking control of your internal state, you will feel in control of yourself, which means you will feel more in control of the external as well. Rather than pointing your attention outside, try to point your attention towards you. Just control yourself. Be here in the now and actually do the task and actually do the thing that you're supposed to do. And by doing that and being present and being in the moment, you'll feel way more in control of your life and of the external world as well, without you even actually trying to control the external world. So when you detach from the outcome, the process itself becomes lighter, it becomes cleaner, and it also becomes more enjoyable without you even really trying. You're not constantly checking your scoreboard, whatever that is, and you're not mentally measuring distance. You're simply doing what needs to be done and doing it to the best of your current ability. And ironically, this state accelerates results more reliably than force because it keeps you inside laminar flow. It keeps you flowing. And flow isn't something you manufacture. It's something that shows up when you remove the pressure that destroys it. So you don't even have to work on creating flow. You just have to stop doing the things that destroy it. With the outcome no longer looming over you, your actions basically reconnect into a continuous rhythm that feels far more sustainable and far more enjoyable. Attachment to the outcome tends to amplify your emotions in a way that distorts perception. So you essentially interpret neutral events as signs of failure or success, even though that label is something that you have attached to it, and you take setbacks personally and you catastrophize small delays. Reality becomes harder to read. It just becomes, in general, it becomes messy. So letting go quiets all of that emotional surge and it stabilizes you. And being still emotionally doesn't mean a lack of feeling. It just means you're not being dragged by your feelings. So you think more clearly because you're not reacting to imagined consequences of events that haven't even occurred. Letting go also widens your perspective. When you're not fixated on a singular outcome, you start seeing multiple pathways. You start seeing hidden opportunities and probably some unexpected alternatives that would have been invisible under the pressure you were feeling. And this awareness will feed your creativity, and it will also improve your decision making because you're now navigating the full map instead of one narrow forced route. And you'll realize the universe is way more flexible than your initial plan. And sometimes the outcome you didn't expect is far better than the one you were trying to demand from the universe. So with a wider view, you adjust and you adapt way more naturally as well, which keeps the flow smooth even when the conditions change. Now, there's also a deeper layer of letting go, and it involves detaching your identity from the outcome. So when you believe your worth depends on a result, you create enormous internal turbulence because now failure becomes existential success too, rather than informational and purely data. So detachment removes that existential pressure. A failed attempt just becomes a failed attempt. It's not a verdict on who you are, and it's nothing else but an experiment. Your identity no longer sits on fragile ground, and this freedom makes you way harder to break. And you'll be able to start taking smarter, calculated risks because the emotional cost of failure has now completely disappeared. It's just you doing a task, and whether it succeeds or not, it doesn't really matter because you finally see it for what it truly is, just an experiment. And the final element of letting go is release. And this is the subtle moment when basically your nervous system recognizes it doesn't need to brace for impact anymore. Your body relaxes, your breathing steadies, your thoughts become more coherent instead of scattered. And this allows laminar flow to return because the internal disruption has now faded. Once that release is felt, once you actually feel that, you naturally move into a more balanced mental state, which becomes the foundation for the next part. So let's talk about the flow alignment loop. There comes a point where understanding the ideas isn't enough, and you need a way to actually use them in the middle of real life. So this is where the flow alignment loop becomes your anchor. It gives you a simple, memorable cycle you can run in seconds that brings you back into steady internal movement. Now the loop has 3 parts: lighten, level, and lean. And each one handles a different layer of turbulence so you don't get pulled into any emotional spirals. And it's not a ritual or a routine, it's just a way of becoming aware of the moment before the moment actually takes over. So you can think of it as a reset button that you use in small moments when you start to feel that you're getting out of alignment and out of balance. Maybe your breath shortens, or your thoughts start jumping around, or you start trying to predict every possible scenario, or maybe your stomach tightens. That's when you run the loop, because those small moments are where you either stay in flow or slip out of alignment. So the more often you cycle through the loop, the more natural it will become. And it's almost like muscle memory, but for your mind. So the first part of the loop is really important because you can't return to balance without removing the thing that knocked you off balance in the first place. And this is where lighten outcome. So this part is all about really dropping that emotional weight you added to the moment. And almost all turbulence begins with over-importance or overthinking or some kind of invisible feeling of force, essentially. When we talk about lightening, it doesn't mean lowering your standards or caring less. It means taking the emotional inflation out of the situation so your head stops treating it like a crisis of some sort. So you do this by pausing for a second, noticing where you're feeling tension, and letting that tension dissolve, just becoming aware of it, just placing your awareness on that feeling of tension. It sounds very small and very basic, but it gives your mind room to breathe again. For example, you catch yourself rushing your words because you're afraid of messing up. So you take one slower breath and steady your tone. You notice your thoughts beginning to speed up while you're working. So instead of fighting them, you actually let them settle down by bringing your attention back to what's right in front of you. These seemingly small actions can seem almost too simple, but they pull you out of the spiral before the spiral even becomes strong enough to drag you. And they change your physiology just enough to pull you back into clarity. Now, lightening puts you back into a position where you can actually hear yourself think again, which sets you up for the part of the loop that brings the mind back to the center. And once that emotional weight drops even a little, your state shifts enough that you're ready to move into the part of the loop that restores your balance. Clarity only lasts if the mind settles into a neutral position. So leveling is where you bring your attention back to center, and it's where you stop amplifying meaning, stop exaggerating consequences, and also come back to what's actually happening instead of what your mind is projecting. So when you level yourself, you're basically telling your nervous system that this moment isn't a threat and doesn't need to be treated like one. And that will pull the emotional distortion out of the situation. And you do this by asking yourself a simple grounding question like, what's actually happening right now? Or what's the real next step here? And those questions cut through the noise and pull you back into reality instead of the version of your mind actually invented. And when you level, you're choosing not to dramatize the moment. You're choosing not to let your brain create imaginary stories, and you're choosing the center. And the center is always where your best thinking actually happens. You'll feel your pace slow down in a good way, not in a lazy way, but in a stable way. And as your internal state starts evening out, your reactions will stop being reactions and start becoming responses, which is exactly what laminar flow feels like in the mind. So with the emotional weight dissolved and your internal balance restored, the next natural step is to move forward again, but in a way that doesn't reintroduce pressure and turbulence. So leaning is where you take the next action without force. It's the part of the loop where you move, but you move cleanly. You're not pushing, you're not rushing, you're not trying to jump 10 steps ahead. You're simply doing the next real step with a steady hand and steady mind. Leaning is subtle, but it's also powerful because it creates forward motion without really disturbing any of your balance. Leaning is not forcing yourself to work harder. It's not trying to bulldoze yourself through resistance. It's the opposite. It's letting yourself glide into the action that makes sense right now instead of the action you think will impress someone or prove something, which obviously comes from a wrong place. So when you lean in, actions link together almost automatically. One step basically leads to the next and the next and the next, and your mind stays quiet enough to notice what's actually needed instead of panicking about what might happen. So after a while, leaning in will become the most natural thing in the world. You'll start associating progress with steadiness and neutrality and grounded concentration rather than some force and push. This is where sustained performance comes from, right? Leaning is the kind of action taking that you can maintain for years instead of days because you're now not relying on just pushing yourself as hard as possible and thinking you're actually doing something or that you're actually changing something. So the beauty of this whole thing is that it's not a one-time sequence. It's a loop that you can go through over and over again. So you go through Lighten, Level, and Lean again and again throughout the day, and you use it whenever you feel like you're going out of center. And it becomes a quick check-in with yourself. The loop will keep you in rhythm because you're always bringing yourself back before things spiral too far. And you can use it in the middle of a conversation or during work or at the gym or before you post content, while making decisions, or whenever. The loop gives you something stable to lean on, which keeps your inner world from getting hijacked by emotion or pressure. And the more often you run the loop, the faster your nervous system learns how to stay in balance without being pushed or forced in any way. So once you've been using the loop for a while, you'll start noticing that it doesn't just help you in intense moments, and it can become something that shapes the way you think. It also can shape the way you pace yourself and the way you move through your goals day after day and the way you move through life. You don't necessarily have to go through life pushing everything and forcing everything. A lot of the times that creates the opposite effect. Let's go over the review. We talked about the paradox of effortless achievement. We talked about letting go of the outcome. We talked about the flow alignment loop. And finally, the review and your action items for the day or the next few days. So first, start applying. Start using the flow alignment loop throughout your day. Whenever you feel like the moment is starting to feel heavier than it should, just run the loop in real time and lighten the emotional weight and level your internal state and just lean into the next step. And take a few minutes each morning to walk yourself through the 3 steps so that they're fresh in your mind before the day pulls you in 2 different directions. Just a quick mental reminder of lighten, level, and lean so that the loop becomes your default corrective pattern. And finally, use the loop during small situations, not just big ones, because the small moments are where turbulence usually begins and where most people miss it. When you practice the loop often, you basically condition your mind to stay balanced before any pressure has a chance to actually build up. And the more you rehearse it in low stakes moments, the easier it becomes to actually stay calm, clear, and aligned when the stakes rise. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more, comment below what you'd like to see next. And if you're an entrepreneur, creator, or professional and you want my help in reaching your next level by mastering and optimizing your health, wealth, love, and self, then book a call using the first link in the description. We'll break down basically where you are right now, map out your next steps, and see if working together one-on-one would make any sense. With that being said, thank you for being here, and I'm going to see you in the next one.